For the Diplomacy Broadcast Network, I'm David Hood, and this is Deadline, DBN's monthly news program. Dateline, July 2020. For our top story tonight, we take a look at the current state of the diplomacy hobby, both online and face-to-face. With many diplomacy players stuck at home due to coronavirus restrictions, otherwise disparate groups from around the world have come together to play in tournaments traditionally held in person. Online communities have seen a surge in new interest. Later in the broadcast, we'll talk with Russ Dennis of the Diplomacy Briefing newsletter and host a roundtable on the future of the hobby with leading organizers. But first, a look at headlines from around the world of diplomacy. The spring issue of the Diplomatic Pouch contained a bombshell concerning the death of longtime hobby organizer and publisher Larry Peary in March of last year. The issue included a letter written by Peary to the Pouch just days before he took his own life. In it, Peary mused about his diplomacy career, which spanned over 50 years. Peary was involved in the publication of many dipzines, including the venerable Diplomacy World, and he was one of the founders of the World Diplomacy Championships, the World DipCon. In his letter to the Pouch, Peary describes his efforts to safeguard his physical archive of diplomacy-related documents and his unhappiness that the present hobby did not appear to value them. Peary's letter can be read in full by following the link in the description field below this broadcast. The North American Diplomacy Federation has reorganized under the guidance of current President Siobhan Nolan. Along with new corporate status, a new board of directors has been assembled, including Tanya Gill of Ontario, Randy Lawrence Hurt of Massachusetts, Chris Brand from British Columbia, and David Miller from the DC area. The NADF is forming committees to work on the integration of online and face-to-face players, the fostering of a welcoming environment for all hobbyists, and the establishment of a dynamic website to help promote diplomacy in all its forms. Siobhan will join us later on the program for the roundtable on the state of the hobby. In tournament news, Tanya Gill has won the Boston Massacre contest held on June 20th. Maxime Popov from Iowa took the silver, while Benji Aarons Richardson of the United Kingdom, currently living in Israel, took the bronze. Gill catapulted to her first place finish by way of an Austrian solo, taking 6 centers in one turn to climb to 16, and then winning with 20 supply centers the following turn. Here's the tournament winner, describing her experience to DBN analyst Brandon Fogel during the network's Boston Massacre wrap-up show.
I don't know. I think I've gotten into the groove of it. I think when you play a country enough times, you start to see the patterns that form around you, and you start to figure out what other countries kind of want to hear. And like for me, I think what has led to a lot of top boards as Austria has been getting Russia on my side. Just something as simple as that makes the game so much easier. So, I've just kind of, been thrown in this situation quite a few times, and like just figuring out what works in that regard has been what has helped the score, I suppose. Practice makes perfect.
The long-running magazine Diplomacy World published its 150th issue this month. The publication began in 1974 and is currently published quarterly. To celebrate the milestone, editor Doug Kent republished an interview with diplomacy inventor Alan Calhoun. Also included articles on the movement of face-to-face games to the virtual space and a new debate over scoring systems. The next major event on the face-to-face calendar is the Liberty Cup, normally held in Philadelphia, but which is going virtual this year due to the virus. The tournament will include 2 rounds in one day, August 1st, and will use the Carnage scoring system. Tournament director Bill Hackenbrack reports strong registration and already looks to have at least 10 boards per round. A link to the tournament website can be found at diplobn.com. And DBN will provide game day live stream coverage of both rounds. The Windy City Weasels, Chicago's diplomacy club, will stage its league championship game on July 26th, and DBN will provide live coverage. The game will feature defending champion Ali Adib, regular season champion Chris Kelly, DixieCon champion Christian Klein, as well as on-air DBN personalities Brendan Fogel and Brian Cravel. Be sure to tune in for all the Chicago-style diplomacy action at 3 p.m. Eastern Time right here on this channel. In other club news, the D.C. area's diplomacy club, the Potomac Tea and Knife Society, began a year of league play using Carnage scoring, with 2 virtual games held on July 5th, using Backstabber and Discord. Past North American champ Rick Desper dominated one board with a 14-center board top as France, while new PTKS member Caleb Withers, relocated from New Zealand, topped the other board as a 10-center England to the AT of Sam Feldman and Bill Hackenbracht. Variant enthusiasts have been especially active online during the COVID era on a variety of platforms. Duplicity has recently undergone a reboot and now includes variants such as the 5-player Ancient Mediterranean and 7-player Canton. Europa Renovatio is a 36-player map set in Europe in 1450, while Divided States is a 50-player map, with each player controlling a separate U.S. state. Both are available on V Diplomacy. Variant games being housed on Discord and promoted on the Play Diplomacy forums include 2 maps by Alex Runke and Chris Helwig, Saga of the Nine, a 9-player Norse mythology variant, and Order of the Dragon, a 10-player map set in Europe in 1400. Both games were played as preliminary rounds for the upcoming Discord-based variant tournament, the 2021 Tournament Through Time. Turning to our feature story tonight, the diplomacy hobby has always been somewhat fragmented. In pre-internet days, there was the divide between face-to-face club and tournament players on the one hand, and the play-by-mail hobbyists on the other hand, with the flagship Diplomacy World attempting to bridge that gap. The advent of play-by-email games and web-based games did not end this fragmentation. Coronavirus restrictions have led the face-to-face hobby to shift its tournaments online to what are now called virtual face-to-face events. Predominantly online players have been joining these events, as well as increasing their play on the existing web-based or app-based diplomacy platforms. Currently, the site Web Diplomacy runs approximately 600 active games, with Play Diplomacy at 725 and V Diplomacy at 335. The Android-based app Conspiracy hosts nearly 800 active games, with yet more games being run on Backstabber and Duplicity. The Nexus community enjoys scores of participants for its online seasons of press games played on many of the sites and apps I just mentioned. In addition, there is a very active forum for diplomacy players on Reddit. For a bird's eye view of the hobby at large, as well as its various components, I turn to Russ Dennis, otherwise known as Umble the Heap, publisher of the indispensable hobby newsletter, The Diplomacy Briefing. You may well be the most qualified person to answer this question for our viewers. What is the current state of the diplomacy hobby in your view?
Well, one of the great things that is happening right now in the diplomacy hobby is the connections, which is really, for me at least, the reason that I started the briefing. The briefing was really to just help connect the different communities of diplomacy and let them know what was going on. And so currently, at least in this last year, we've seen, I think, a lot more connections across the board. And as far as the current state of the diplomacy hobby, I mean, I think online has, in a lot of ways, probably been about as healthy as it has been. The online community has been pretty innovative in using some of the different technology out there. Face-to-face has got an online presence now, right now with these virtual tournaments. And so on that side, I think there's some really good health. But I think also just talking about the diplomacy hobby, one of the things that, as far as the health, at least especially in North America, is the fact that the face-to-face clubs, we've seen some good growth there, but I think they're really, for the diplomacy hobby to make that next step, is to see a lot more of these local clubs start up in different cities. So in that sense, there's still probably a lot more health to go in that regards, but there's some really, really good local clubs right now, hoping to see more happen. And hopefully, too, to see some new tournaments starting up. So I think the diplomacy hobby, if you're looking at it, I think historically, we're seeing some really good things. But with what the hobby can be, there's still, I think, a lot more to go.
Well, following up on that, do you have any concerns as the hobby enters this period of change that we're in? Concerns about the health of the hobby or how it might go the wrong way?
Yeah. So my understanding of hobby history is that there's been moments when the diplomacy hobby, I think, was on the verge of taking the next step forward. And what has often happened is there has been, I think, an unwillingness to collaborate or an unwillingness to compromise on issues. You know, the thing about diplomacy is that this is a game, right? It is not life or death, though sometimes we treat it that way. People come to diplomacy generally, you know, to step out from what currently is either their job or what's going on in this world. And so because of that, a lot of times I feel like there's a lot of personal investment. And so sometimes that can cause people, if they don't get their way in something, to just throw up their hands. And that I've seen in the past, from my understanding of the history, has caused problems. But with the online and the face-to-face community interacting, I think, in a very unprecedented way, I think the people that are leaders in that area really need to be sure to say, you know what, I don't have to get my way in everything. I'm going to choose to collaborate for the good of the hobby. I think another part there, too, is just the importance of mutual respect from the different players, from the people with different backgrounds. Respect, I think, is so important for this hobby to grow in a greater way. I think it's very, very vital. And those would probably be the two concerns, just maybe allowing pettiness or outside influences to hurt the hobby.
Understood. Well, it sounds like you've got your finger to the pulse of many different subsets of the hobby, particularly in the production of your hobby newsletter, the Diplomacy Briefing. There must be many developments out there which intrigue you as a longtime hobbyist. Tell us what excites you the most about this time.
Oh, well, the virtual games for sure. This is something brand new for the hobby that just holds so much promise. It is very difficult for the vast, vast majority of diplomacy players to actually go to a physical tournament. And even though, and that's with those that would like to do it, then there's a whole other part that the idea of spending the kind of money to go to a tournament and wondering how would I be good enough to even compete in that also, you know, is daunting. And these virtual tournaments really help bridge the gap there. So people can try out their hands on in tournaments with quick deadlines and a little bit, you know, get bit by the bug of the excitement of face-to-face play. So these virtual tournaments are great at bringing people together. They're great, I really think, of helping that vision that Alan Kellhammer had be accessible. I mean, could you imagine if he was alive today, seeing people playing diplomacy from all around the world doing real-time negotiations? I mean, he would be blown away. And so this time of virtual tournaments is something that I'm hoping to see go forward. It is incredibly exciting. We've already seen a lot of online players get the chance to try that out. And hopefully, too, face-to-face players see that there's some really solid players that they may not have got to the tournament, but, I mean, they can definitely play in this format.
Thank you so much for your insights, and thanks for being on our broadcast.
Thank you, David.
And now for our hobby roundtable discussion. Can hobbyists in all of our different diplomacy spaces find each other? Do they need to? To what extent should we promote unification of the hobby versus decentralization? How should we promote face-to-face player to online players and vice versa? Here to answer these and other questions are Siobhan Nolan, current president of the North American Diplomacy Federation, Marcus Zelstra, also known online as Captain Meme, a moderator at Web Diplomacy and Nexus, and the star of the Diplostrats YouTube channel, and Alex Ronka, also known online as No Pun Intended, one of the admins at Play Diplomacy. Siobhan, let me start with you. What are the biggest issues facing our hobby as you see them?
I think right now the big obvious issue facing, especially the face-to-face hobby, is COVID-19. We can't meet and play in person the way that we used to. Our usual tournament schedule has been completely just left to the wayside. We have figured out some ways to work around that with our virtual tournaments, which has been fantastic. But until COVID-19 is over, the face-to-face hobby will not look anything like what we were used to. To sort of, continue on, the other issues in the hobby right now that we are confronting are player recruitment and retention. It's really hard to find new players and bring them in. And that is one, yes, COVID-19 plays a role. Two, historically, we have not really reached out and worked with online communities. And three, there are questions of how do we make the community more welcoming and more open.
Marcus, how about from your point of view? What do you see as the main issues facing the hobby right now?
Right. Obviously, I'm looking at it more from an online perspective. I have played face-to-face, but I'm very much mostly an online player. In the online game, we're actually seeing a huge increase in the number of players from the COVID events, just because people have a lot more spare time on their hands. So the main problems on our end have been things like how do you prevent NMRs, how do you prevent civil disorders? With so many new people coming into the game, there's a lot of people who will just drop it at a moment's notice, and then you've got some serious problems there. But there's also issues of we'd really like to be more involved with the face-to-face community and be getting online players shifted towards looking at the face-to-face game. So looking at ways to do that and to get people to put their face into the world, because most of the time they're hiding behind an anonymous nickname and so on. That's a bit of a problem for face-to-face players, and it's something that it's quite difficult to get them to go and do. So,
well, Marcus, what do you see as strategies that we could use to integrate the face-to-face community more with the online diplomacy community?
Yeah. So definitely the first step is something I believe you're already doing. I haven't taken part in any virtual face-to-face events yet, but the virtual face-to-face events are fantastic for getting online players into the face-to-face hobby, because it's something they can do without leaving their homes. Quite often it's something they can do without having to be on camera. They can just go over voice, which is a lot more comfortable to some people. The other thing that can be done is just get in touch with more diplomacy sites, try and get more advertising out there. I know Web Diplomacy has been putting up banners for the face-to-face tournaments, which has worked, and we've seen some Web Diplomacy players take part. But yeah, that's pretty much the main things I can see to do it. Work more with the online community, I guess.
Alex, let's riff off that just a second. You're heavily involved in play diplomacy, and I know you're also a significant participant in the variant hobby. How has your segment of the world of diplomacy changed in the times that we're in?
Well, so I'll echo what Marcus said. Right at the start of sort of the shift to quarantines and stay-at-home orders, we happened to have a bug with our registration at Play Diplomacy, which meant that I had to manually kind of verify emails for new users. And so I was actually like very much in touch with the number of new users we were getting every single day. And so we had hundreds of these coming in, which was great. But, with a new user, you're a lot of these folks are still learning the game to begin with. They don't even necessarily know if they're going to stick with it. And so the kind of question of NMRs, going into civil disorder, these sort of things, they happen. But they're going to happen a little bit more with a new user who hasn't kind of gotten the emotional investment in it yet, who's still kind of figuring things out. We get, just mistakes made by people who don't completely understand the rules entirely yet. And so you have to kind of explain to them why this particular support was not cut or things like that. But none of that's really a problem. It's just, onboarding people. I think if you were to look at kind of your kind of original question about the biggest kind of problem today, might be accessibility.
The North American Diplomacy Federation has typically been a face-to-face organization, really. Are there any plans at the NADF to try to reach out to different segments of the population to sort of integrate into what the NADF has been doing in face-to-face and tournament play?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially with this shift to virtual play, we've realized that the communication between these hobbies is more important than ever. And I think it benefits both face-to-face and virtual if we can entwine them more closely. We have had some online players make very successful transitions into the face-to-face hobby. Tanya Gill comes to mind. So yeah, my plans in the immediate are, as I finalize setting up my board for the NADF, there are going to be a formation of a series of committees. And one of those, I want to focus on the integration between face-to-face and online players. And I'm going to comprise that of mostly online players with one or two face-to-face, because the board is already face-to-face players. So what we need to know is who from the online community is interested in this sort of integration, and would they be willing to help us?
So Marcus, let me bring you back into this on the issue of online players. To what extent is there any tension between different groups within the online hobby, and are there ways that could be dealt with in a productive and constructive way?
Yeah, so this is a big part of what the Nexus does, which is another community that I'm working with. There's a huge division in the online community. There are 6 major diplomacy sites I can name off the top of my head, and most of them have completely independent user bases. You don't see a huge number of players playing on multiple sites. They decide on one, they stick with that one, and if you try and convince them to move to another one, you have to have a really good reason, because they're abandoning their rating and they're abandoning, their reputation to go and join a different community and build it all from the ground up. So what the Nexus tries to do is gather all those people together on a platform that they're more likely to have, which in this case is Discord. It's a chat client that a lot of especially younger people tend to have just for talking to their friends anyway. And then you use that client to try and build the community up, and then slowly try to encourage people to go and play on different platforms with the people they get to know there. So yeah, it's definitely a huge issue in the online hobby, the splintering. It's kind of similar to what you see in the face-to-face hobby with, say, European groups and American groups. People do travel between the two and go to tournaments, but for the most part, you're going to see people staying in their respective areas. But in online, there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to go over. There's no extortionate plane fees or anything like that. So it's just a case of trying to coax people out of their shell.
So Alex, coming back to you for just a minute, I mentioned in my intro the tension between centralization and decentralization in the hobby. Do you see that in the online world? And if you do, why do you think that is?
Well, it's definitely there. I think to a certain extent, it's a little bit inevitable, just because of how these sites are run. There is no official diplomacy site, which can lead to very, very different sites. Even V-diplomacy and web diplomacy, which have more or less the same code base, have a very different approach to variants. With V-diplomacy, it's sort of, we will put up any variant that someone's willing to do the work to build. And web diplomacy keeps that much, much tighter. And play diplomacy is kind of in between, where we slowly adopt new ones, and we have a number of variants that we can kind of tie to others, so you can mix and match different pieces of rules with each other and maps. And everybody's got a kind of different approach to doing that. But that's one of the advantages online that you just don't really get a lot with a face-to-face crowd. I don't know how bringing together those communities would really look. I think that we absolutely could. I think that the kind of ridiculous bad blood arguments between the communities that have happened occasionally in the past are kind of stupid, and so we want to avoid those.
Well, on the issue of silly disagreements and so forth, Siobhan, let's talk about the face-to-face hobby just a second. So is there a tension in the face-to-face hobby between the concept of centralizing hobby functions and the concept of decentralizing tournaments and hobby functions? And if so, how do we bridge that?
I think you're going to get a lot of different answers to that question, but in a nutshell, there is resistance to centralization. Tournament directors across, North America, which is what I'm familiar with, are very resistant to the idea of someone coming in and telling them how their event has to be run. And I'm not here to advocate for mandating a certain scoring system or certain things, but there do need to be standards. We need a minimum basic rule set, standards for behavior, things like that. And I think over the last 5 years or so, tournament directors are starting to give up a little bit of their autonomy for a basic level of consistency and some centralization. But I think that, they're gonna hold on to that until their dying breath because it's their event. And I often say that these tournaments are tournament directors' babies.
Marcus, we're getting close to the end of our roundtable discussion. Do you have any other thoughts you'd like to share with our viewers about the state of the hobby and the extent to which the hobby could be improved in terms of organization or integration?
Yeah, so especially on the face-to-face front, it's still kind of mind-blowing to me that the face-to-face community uses WebEx Teams, which is at the time I joined it, Cisco Spark. I think it's probably much better for a professional environment, and probably a lot more people who have jobs and aren't in university use it for various things, so it's kind of convenient to them. But the vast majority of the online community uses Discord, and as far as I'm aware, a lot of the virtual face-to-face tournaments are also done on Discord. I might be mistaken on that because I haven't participated in any yet. It seems to me like they should try to make that migration if possible. Obviously, it's always hard to coax people out and try to integrate into a new community and onto a new platform like that. But I really think that would be a huge step in bringing the communities a little bit closer together.
How about you, Alex? Any final thoughts about the state of the hobby and the extent to which we could help with hobby integration and avoid fragmentation?
Oh man. Well, I think he's right. Bringing folks onto Discord would probably be a good idea in general. We owe a lot to Chris Martin for getting the face-to-face community kind of online and together in a sort of central place. And he's the one that kind of pushed WebEx and had been Cisco Spark and whatnot before, because he's a Cisco guy, or at least was. I think he still works there. Yeah. And he's great. And it's a decent tool, but it's just not where all the people are. People are on Slack for work, or they're on Discord for everything else. Or they're on Microsoft Teams or something like that. WebEx is just not as big a community. So I don't think that's like a silver bullet, but I think that's a good start. I do think the question of face-to-face standardization, it's a little tricky, but if you could like put together a set of standards that could also be followed to some extent online, to have a kind of, not necessarily one standard diplomacy, but like a few different standards of tournament diplomacy that like a site could actually host themselves and run themselves, whether it's a scoring system or whatever, and what sort of rules about turns and such. I think that could be really interesting to be able to say, we are playing North American tournament format A, similar to how Magic the Gathering has their formats of play that they can play both online and in person. And I think that would be an interesting way to help people learn what the sort of subtle differences are in the game itself, in playing in a face-to-face tournament versus an online game.
Siobhan, how about you? Final thoughts here.
Final thoughts, I would like to echo the note about WebEx Teams. I know I, for one, would prefer to have one fewer chat client on my phone that I have to check every day, and moving everyone to Discord, I think, makes a lot of sense. It's what gaming communities use these days. And I do think everyone will be seeing a lot more face-to-face players active on Discord in the near future because, as noted, that's what we've been using for our tournaments. So I think that's a great step, and it's going to be difficult to get everyone to make the move because they've made the decision to get online in one place. But I do think that you will see that transition happening. I also really like the note about maybe having a set of standard rules. So, whether it's style A, style B. And I think that's actually something, Alex, that we could work together on if you would be interested in doing that with me. Other than that, I just want to make a note that, I love the face-to-face hobby, and I think we're all doing amazing things in figuring out how to adapt to these crazy and uncertain times. And I'm really excited to see players from all over the globe, all over play styles and face-to-face and online coming together and learning to love this game together.
Well, thank you very much, Siobhan, and thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Alex, for joining us here on Deadline, the newscast of the Diplomacy Broadcast Network. And thank all of you watching at home. We hope you enjoyed the first broadcast of Deadline. If you have news, ideas for features, or feedback of any kind, please feel free to send an email to info@diplobn.com, or you can drop me a line directly at davidhood@dixiecon.com. For all of our other broadcast offerings, visit our website at diplobn.com. This is David Hood signing off. I wish you brightness and bliss and, of course, Belgium.